Okay, so let's get started. The rest of the folks hopefully will drift in as we're going along here. Today, as you know, is the final class here, gathering, where we'll get a chance to talk about your thesis topics to help spark some ideas in other people and help answer any questions that you might have in trying to figure out exactly what you're going to be talking about. That's one of the two objectives today. The other objective I have today, we'll do that sort of in the latter part of the class. But I want to share with you, because I won't get to see a number of you probably after this. After you get your final grade, you probably want to talk. No, I won't see a lot of you after this. So I want to be able to take this opportunity to share with you a few strategic secrets. You've learned a number of tactical secrets that are really quite important and have had a lot of important impact on history in this class, and not just things that you didn't happen to read that were somewhere, but actual secrets that you wouldn't have found out about anywhere else, such as the existence of the secret treaty in 1972 that Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon entered into, that Dick Cheney and Bush Sr. attempted to enforce with Saudi Arabia in opposition to Saddam going into Kuwait. Also, you would never have really known anything about the note that was sent by George Bush Sr. to Saddam, telling him basically that it was okay with Bush Sr. if Saddam chose to invade and occupy Kuwait, which triggered the entire cycle of events that led to the invasion and occupation of the Middle Eastern oil fields. The other things, you wouldn't have known anything about the secret meeting that Cheney had with King Fahd and Crown Prince Abdullah. You wouldn't have known anything about the fact that it was Osama bin Laden that the chief of security of Saudi Arabia, Turki bin Faisal, wanted to have push out Saddam from Kuwait instead of inviting the U.S. in. There are a handful of these important tactical pieces of history that you'd never hear about otherwise, not the least of which is, of course, the fact that it was the people from Brown Brothers Harriman under the chairmanship or CEO-ship of George Herbert Walker, the grandfather and great-grandfather, respectively, of George Bush Sr. and W. Bush, that you wouldn't have known that they were the ones that secretly financed the rise of the Third Reich. You wouldn't know anything about those things. Then a number of other major tactical secrets that you could have learned about in this class if we'd had a whole semester, a whole 2 semesters, a whole year to do the course. But we shared a number of these things with you here that are tactically important secrets. What I want to do today, in light of the fact that I won't get to see many of you again, is share with you 3 what I think are the most important secrets that I've come to know in the 50 years that I've been out practicing law, and 53 years since graduating from college. And in honor of being the final lecture today, I'll start out with one of them. And this was the secret that was shared by Professor Crane Brinton. A number of folks in the back probably know about this, but your generation doesn't. Crane Brinton was the professor of intellectual history at Harvard University. When I'd graduated from the college in '67 and had gone up to the law school in the fall of 1967, and in the spring of 1968, when about this time of the year, when we were coming to the end of classes, Crane Brinton, who had been the professor of intellectual history at Harvard University for over 40 years, was asked in his final lecture before he retired to share with his students the most important single idea that he had encountered in his entire 50 years of study in the field of intellectual history. And the class of 67 at Harvard College was the last all-male college, last male class at Harvard University. And so when he was getting ready to deliver his final lecture, students who had graduated from his classes down over the whole 50-year period all came to Cambridge to hear this final lecture that he was going to deliver. And they had to move his lecture to a bigger hall on the campus so they could all come. And I was up at the law school, so I was fortunate to be able to just go down across the road to be able to hear this. And so I come into the lecture hall, and it's filled to the rafters with several generations actually of students that he had, ranging all the way from 75-year-old guys down to people from the most recent class, myself. And he was asked in this final lecture, as I said, to share with his students the most important single idea that he had encountered during his tenure as the professor of the intellectual history. And he said, well, this is going to be easy because I know very well what this is. And so he comes into the class and he opens up his book and he said, look, I've been asked to tell you the most important idea that I've encountered in the past 50 years, and it's this. He said that all of the greatest minds in our human family have all ultimately come to the conclusion that our human species is right on the very brink and in the process of evolving into the next stage of biological evolution. And that this next stage of evolution is going to be as different from Homo sapiens as Homo sapiens are from Homo erectus, out of which we evolved. And he said that, the particular evolutionary quality that is going to finish evolving to cause this leap into the next stage of human evolution is the evolution of a faculty like seeing or hearing that is able to directly and experientially encounter the unitive phenomenon that bonds every ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the entire universe into one single unified harmonic whole, he said. And just as sight, eyeballs, evolved teleologically up into full manifestation in response to the existence of a pre-existent stimuli, that is light waves, of a particular frequency and amplitude. He said, and just like sound, just like the complexity of the inner ear evolved teleologically into full formation in response to the pre-existent stimuli of sound, which again is a little phenomenon with a particular pitch and amplitude. He said that this faculty is evolving in response to the actual physical field that bonds together every ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the entire universe. And that by dint of this experience that you have through this evolving faculty, it will be like seeing light or hearing sound. It's not something that you reflect on, you think about, but the fact is that you directly experience it, like seeing or hearing. They said by dint of this experience, you will know what type of conduct on the part of individual human beings, both individual and collective, is either harmonious with or disharmonious to the natural order of the universe. And he said, and that's why I think that the young men in this most recent set of classes is refusing to go fight in Vietnam. And then he closed the book and walked away and died within 2 months after retiring. And so he never expounded upon it, never explained it in any further detail, but he wanted to make sure that his students knew that. And so I wanted to convey that to you, because this is the person who has spent his entire life studying the rising and evolution of ideas in the human culture. And so he shared that secret with us. And I wanted to share that with you before we parted our ways. The second major strategic secret that I want to share with you is the one that Julia and I touched on the other day, which is this thing by William Strauss in How. Strauss and How wrote this book. I mentioned it to you, but in that case I was only talking with Julia, but I think you should know about this too. The book that's called Generations, A History of America's Future. And I just gave it a quick thumbnail for Julia's benefit, but I want to just take it a little more slowly and share it with you, that this insight that's been come to by this Harvard and Yale sociologists that were working together on this have come to the realization, after doing thousands of interviews and having their students do many of them for them and bring them the data, that they have come to the conclusion, as I mentioned, that in every 100-year period, that there are 4 generations that are born, and they range anywhere from 21 years in length to 25 years in length or so. And that during this 100-year period, there is always one of the generations that is an idealist generation, which I'll explain in a moment. And it's followed by a reactive generation. And that is followed by a civic generation. And that generation is followed by an adaptive generation. And what this means is that the idealist generation, and all of this is in relationship to addressing the major secular crisis that occurs during that 100-year period, to which the human family is required to respond and to try to solve in some way. And as I pointed out, in the case of the 20th century, that major secular challenge was the worldwide massive depression and world war that encompassed the planet at that time. And Franklin Roosevelt, a member of the civic generation, undertook to try to address the issue of the failure of the economic system and came to grips with it and established a whole set of New Deal programs that stimulated the economy, reined in the excesses of privately owned shareholder stock corporations, and the banks and the financial institutions, et cetera, provided rural electrification for everyone, set up Social Security, et cetera. And that is an example of the response to the secular crisis of the 20th century by the members of the civic generation and Franklin Roosevelt's generation, with the tutoring of the progressive generation of that 20th century, which was the progressive movement that arose up out of the Chautauqua movement that I've mentioned a couple times in class, and that the Chautauqua movement rose up in response to the robber barons. That entire period from 1868 to 1898, culminating in the McKinley administration, that was just rampantly devouring the resources of the country and laying waste to the environment and abusing and manipulating employees and exploiting child labor, et cetera. and that in our century, the 21st century, our generation, the baby boomer generation, is the idealist generation of this 21st century. And the Xers, the X generation students that are older than you, that are they're about 35, 36 years old on up to about 56 or so. That whole group of X generation people are the reactive generation. And your generation is the millennial generation that goes basically from about 35 years old all the way on down to about 15, 14 years old now. So all of you are in that millennial generation. And you are the civic generation of the 21st century. And therefore, it's going to fall to you the task of solving the major secular crisis of this 21st century, which virtually uncontestedly is going to be global climate change. And you will do so in potential dialogue with the members of the idealist generation, this baby boomer generation, many of whom you see gathered out behind you each day in this class to come to listen to this class. And what the discovery is that the change that takes place, that the coming forward of the civic generation starts to happen right when the idealists are just about ready to give up hope. That when they see things manifesting, that they understand to be the direct consequence of the previous civic generation not having dealt thoroughly enough with the problem. And that they came to a set of compromises to address and solve the immediate crisis that was before them at the time. And that they made these compromises, and because of that, some of the most fundamental flaws that were giving rise to that secular crisis never got thoroughly cauterized. And so what I'm saying to you right now is that the events that are befalling you now with the global climate change and the chaos that this is in the process of getting ready to cause in your lives and in the lives of your children is going to be a task that you need to address, and that what I want to be able to do is, in a class like this, is to have given you some assistance to get an idea of what the idealist generation of this 21st century, the baby boomers, have learned and have come to understand about what's gone on during our reign here, because it's time to begin to turn over the reins to you to solve this crisis, which you're going to be confronting. It's not that we aren't going to be confronting it, but we're going to be confronting it between the ages of 75, and 100, which means that it's mainly from a rocking chair that is going to be kind of perceived. There'll be a number of us that are going to still be out on the parapets and throwing bricks with you. But the ultimate solutions are going to have to be found by you, because one of the characteristics of the idealist generation is that we don't let go, that we don't yield on the principles, and that therefore oftentimes miss the opportunity to strike a compromise that will actually save your lives. And that you're going to have that responsibility for having to make this set of decisions. And there'll be moments when you'll remember what I told you, because you're going to be looking right at someone who is from this group that we keep talking about, this 1% these kind of Hamiltonians, these financiers and capitalists, state capitalists and misogynists and racists that are going to be sitting with you, and they're going to make an offer to you, right? And they're going to just tell you, they say, look it, if you really want to stop global climate change, just let us own the next source of energy. Just make sure that we as the capitalists can own and control this so that we could either set up big, huge solar arrays in one big center and then meter the electricity out to you so that we own it, or let us have nuclear power with power stations so that they're so incredibly dangerous that only we can own them. And we set up super security all around them so nobody can interfere in it. And let us also control the water. Let us control the water, and let us control the source of energy, and stop whining. Stop your whining about global climate change, because if you really want to stop global climate change, we can stop it in a minute. Okay? And you're going to have that experience. And you're going to notice them sitting across the table from you, and you're going to remember Mephistopheles and know what the deal is that you're being offered. But I hasten to point out that it is a potential weakness of the idealist generation not to be able to make any compromise. And so some compromises may well be required, usually are. But also remember, when you're 75 in the next century, and you'll notice that a new major secular crisis is falling upon the people, you will know that it is because you compromised too much. Okay? So try not to do that. So try to listen to us and do what you're told. No, you don't have to do that. No. So just do keep in mind the ideals and try to preserve them to the greatest extent possible. Okay? And it doesn't mean that you have to be convinced that the ideals ever really manifested in perfect form at any given time. When you begin to learn things about the founders and Alexander Hamilton and the others that show you that they aren't the great paragons of virtue that you were taught when you were in elementary school, etc. That there's two things you need to remember. Always remember the old Irish aphorism, as I said before, that the Irish referred to Ireland as the old sod. And there's the Irish aphorism, well, the old sod isn't what it used to be. But then it never was. So you have to understand that there is an existential process underway that you're part of to try to make real these ideals. Okay? And I'll do a quick story because I love it so much. That the ancient Greek author Sophocles wrote a Greek tragedy that was called Antigone. Antigone was one of the daughters, along with Electra, that was one of the two daughters of the king of Greece at the time, that Oedipus the king, and these the two daughters were kind of held out of power, and the two sons that Oedipus had were twins. And the two twins, when it came time, when Oedipus fled into the night with the brooches on his eyes and the whole 9 yards and electric lightning all around him and everything, when he discovered that he'd been going to bed with his own mother, that you'll all recall from the discussions of the Oedipus complex, that the two twin sons were still in their infancy, and therefore they couldn't take power. And so Oedipus's brother, Creon, became the temporary ruler the holding power for the two twin sons. And they had these long set of discussions, the city fathers, trying to decide what they were going to do since these were twins, which of them was going to take power. And so the city fathers thought about it, and they said, here's what we're going to do. Because they're twins, we're going to share the power. What we're going to do is have one of the sons rule for an entire year. And at the end of the year, he'll step aside, and the other twin will come in and rule for a year. And then at the end of that year, he'll step aside, and the other son will come back, and we'll do it that way. Well, as it turns out, that as time came to pass, and the twins achieved adulthood, one of the sons took control and ruled for an entire year. And it came to the end of the year, and he said, you know, the more I think about this, the less attractive this idea is of me having to turn over the power to my other twin brother. And after all, I was born first. And so actually I am older. And so therefore, by the laws of primogeniture, I should be ruling. And the other twin was outraged at this. And of course, the city fathers should have been outraged, but they were like moderate Democrats. And what they said is, well, you know, he's got a point there. And besides, he's going to fight if we try to remove him. And that's going to be very disruptive to the whole community. Their people's lives are going to be lost, a lot of bloodshed, you know. So actually, he's got a point there. And, you know, the more we think about it, the more maybe we should just let this go. And so the other twin fled from the city, went out and aroused the rabble from around the city-state and led an attack against the city of Thebes. And the two twin brothers met in hand-to-hand combat out in front of the 7th gate of Thebes. And they slew each other. And so Creon, their uncle, said, oh, shit, now what? And so he rushed out, and what they did is they had really chopped each other up in pretty serious shape, but they gathered together one of the sons and put him up on this big golden shield and put the coins in his eyes and in his mouth, and they paraded him through the entire city as a hero and gave him a hero's burial. And then issued a decree that the other son, who had led the rabble in an attack against the city of Thebes, against the elite, was to be left for carrion, that he was to be left unattended outside of the gates, the 7th gate of Thebes, to rot and be eaten by wild animals. And if anyone attempted to interfere in that and bury him or give him any kind of the ritual rites of passage, they would be executed by being cemented into a cave and allowed to starve and smother. And so they let the body lie there. They did the funeral ceremony. And on the first night, Antigone, the one of the two daughters, there's this famous scene where she's out beneath the full moon and she's feeling completely conflicted, and she remembers that she had been fated by the Delphic oracle. She'd been fated to die at the hands of her family for attempting to save the honor of her brother. And she could never understand how that could possibly become pertinent until now. And so she was saying, oh, this is really terrible. I'm going to have to go out and bury my brother. And I know what's going to happen. I'm going to be executed. This is a terrible thing. And she goes out in the noonday sun, and she walks out with coins, and she puts them in the eyes of her brother and in his mouth and does the ceremony, and she's immediately seized by the garrison troops who are guarding the body, and they drag her before Creon, who is her uncle, and he's her favorite niece. And in fact, she is betrothed to his only son. And so he is heartbroken, but because of him being bound by the rules and regulations not unlike Mueller, says, look, I'm not free to do what I would want to do. I've got to sustain the rules and regulations of the state. And so therefore, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cement you into the cave. And it turns out that his son, Paris, goes into the cave with her. And Creon cements them both into the cave, and they die a horrible death of starving and smothering. And the state is saved. Okay? So that's Sophocles wrote that many 1,000 years ago. But there is a modern version of it that has been written by Jean Anouilh. And it's Antigone. It's Antigone. And Jean Anouilh's Antigone unfolds in exactly the same way, except that when Antigone is standing out beneath the moon doing her famous soliloquy of Sophocles, and she says, oh, no, look, it's come to this. Now I know why I'm fated by the Delphic oracle. I'm going to have to go out in the noonday sun and bury my brother to save his honor. And I'm going to be cemented into this wall. I'm going to die. And she says, nah, I don't think so. I don't think I'm going to do that at all. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hang out here at night, and I'm going to stand watch here until these guards aren't paying attention. So she comes out every night, and the guards are all alert for the first night or two, and then 3 or 4 nights later, they start to get a little more lax. Finally, on the 5th or 6th night, they sort of cast to one side, and they fall asleep. So she sneaks out, and she puts the coins in his eyes, in her brother's eyes, and in his mouth, and buries him up with dirt like this, and then she sneaks away. And she says, that's it, good. I've defied the oracle. My brother's honor is saved, and therefore everything's going to be all right. So she goes out, and then what happens is the guards wake up after a few hours, and they realize somebody's buried this dude, right? And so they're going, oh, shit, now what? So they run off to find Creon, who they wake up in the middle of the night and say, Creon, somebody's buried this dude. Now it's going to shame us. You've made this decree and somebody has defied it. It's going to undermine the authority of the state. And Creon says, look, did anybody see it? And they said, no, nobody saw it. Look, tell you what, you go out and unbury him and take the coins out of his eyes and mouth and keep the coins for yourself and just remain silent about this. So they go, well, all right, and they go out and do it. And they take the money and they unbury him and they dust him off. And the next morning, Antigone is waiting for all of this hullabaloo to break out, that this huge scandal has occurred, and nothing happens. So she goes out by the 7th gate of Thebes, and there he is, unburied, with the coins out of his eyes and mouth and stuff. And she goes, oh, now what? And so she waits another 4 or 5 nights for the guys to fall asleep again. She sneaks out again and puts the coins in his eyes and in his mouth and starts tossing the dirt on him, and the guards wake up. And they snatch her, and they drag her off, and they arrest her. And they bring her up and underneath this big full moon to Creon in his nightcap. And he's standing there, and and they've got her in this hood. And they've dragged her up there, and the guards are saying, Creon, we caught the culprit. Trying to put coins in his mouth and throwing dirt on him. So now we got her. And so Creon says, okay, who is this? And they throw back her cowl, and he says, oh, it's Antigone. Oh, Antigone. I told you not to do this. I told everybody not to do this. Now look at you're putting me in this terrible position. Look, guys, did anybody see this? And the guys go, no, nobody's seen it yet. He said, look, then go back out, put the coins in his mouth and his eyes, and bury him back up again. And he turns to Antigone and says, Antigone, you got to stop doing this. You got to stop doing this. You're undermining the authority of the state. I'm in charge. I've got all these rules and regulations that I have to abide by. You got to stop doing this. I'd have to throw you in this cave and cement you in. And she said, no. She says, turns out I'm fated. I'm fated by the Delphic Oracle to die at the hands of my family, saving the honor of my brother. And he said, oh, that. Yeah, I remember hearing about that. But look, I've got to tell you something. None of that stuff is true. None of that stuff is true. All this stuff about the gods and everything happening and, and us deriving our authority as the head of the state from God and all of that, none of that's true. So you gotta knock it off. I'm here to help you. I want you to be saved. I want to do this to you. So don't go do this anymore, because none of that is true. And she said, no, I believe it's true. And he said, oh no, she's so precocious. And then he said, look, so let me tell you something else, something you don't know. We buried the wrong guy. Okay? It's a real bummer, but they cut each other up so bad that we couldn't really tell one from the other. And so we buried the younger of the twins, who led the attack against the city of Thebes, on a golden shield with coins in his mouth and eyes, and he was given a hero's burial. So he's definitely crossed the river Styx. And the other one, there was the older one who was left out there all chopped up and stuff. And because he died defending the honor of the city, he has already crossed the river Styx. He doesn't need to have all that stuff done. And she said, gee, I didn't know that. And he said, so look, so what you ought to do is just stop doing this, because even assuming all of this stuff is true that you believe in, the younger son has crossed the river Styx because he was given the honor burial, and the older son has already crossed the river Styx, so you don't have to do any of this stuff. And she looked up at him and she said, no, she said, I am fated by the Delphic Oracle to die at the hands of my family to save the honor of my brother. And he said, but remember, he said, none of that is true. And she turned to him and said, that's what you think. I'm going to show you. I'm going to go out in the noonday sun. I'm going to bury him in front of everyone, and you will be forced to cement me into the cave and kill me at the hands of my family. Because it turns out all of those stories are true. And you didn't know it. So I tell you that. I tell you that because there is a dimension of existentialism involved in making these ideals true. Okay? So that you have to participate in this. And so you have a duty to try to figure out why it is that these fundamental principles of natural law that undergird our Constitution, that undergird the fundamental rights of individual human beings, and that give rise to the fundamental natural law right of freedom of speech, freedom of gathering, freedom of press, these doctrines that the original drafters, such as Alexander Hamilton and even Madison himself, didn't really quite believe, but just thought that they were practical things that needed to be done because of the history that they'd had with England. That England was doing certain kinds of things, like harboring troops in people's homes and attacking the press, and interfering with people's right to gather and petition the government. And so that they thought they were doing them just because they were kind of practical things that needed to be done to ensure their ability to withdraw from England. But as it turns out, upon deeper analysis, it turns out to be true that these are fundamental rights that belong to every human being, in that there's an explanation for why that's true. And that the best thing that we can possibly do as the idealist generation is to help explain to you and work with you to understand yourselves, not just because we say so, but to understand yourself how and why this is true. That there is, in fact, such a thing as natural law, and that the natural law gives rise to these fundamental rights for not just human beings, but also for all living things, not only here on our planet, but everywhere in the galaxy. That this is an important insight to come to, and that the evolving of this faculty that Crane Brinton suggests, all of the most intelligent thinkers, men and women down through the ages, have come to understand that this is true. And that they've talked about it, they've written about it, they've written poems about it and music about it. But it's something that you have to access yourself in order to really believe it. And not just believe it, but to know that it's true. Okay, and there are ways in which you can do this. Okay, now the third major secret that I want to tell you about is that when I graduated from the law school and was out practicing law for 3 or 4 years, and I'd done the Pentagon Papers case for the New York Times, and I'd done the case that established the right of journalists to protect their confidential news sources, and had done the case that established the right of unmarried people to have access to birth control. And these are all big Supreme Court cases. And I was at F. Lee Bailey's office after leaving the big firm, the Cahill firm, and we were doing the Watergate burglary case, and we got James McCord, one of the burglars, to write the letter to Judge Sirica, blowing the whistle on the plumbers and stuff. And F. Lee Bailey, whose office was representing James McCord, was trying to get me to represent Michael Angiulo. Michael Angiulo was the head of the mafia in North Boston, and his gunman had gone to this little store, this little mom and pop store, and had said to the owner, "We'd like to sell you some Angiulo Brothers fire insurance." And the man said, "Well, I don't need Angiulo Brothers fire insurance. I have fire insurance already." And they said, "Well, you don't have the kind of fire insurance that'll make sure your building doesn't burn down next Friday night." And to which he responded by saying to them, he said, "Look it, you see these numbers tattooed on my arm?" He said, "I got these at Auschwitz." He said, "And you people don't scare me. I've seen the worst of life." And they turned around and left. And 3 nights later, a black car tracked down his only daughter, who was like 8 months pregnant, out on the Mass Pike, and chased her down on the highway. She pulled the car off into one of these rest areas and ran for the telephone in the telephone booth and started dialing the police, 911. And a person came out of the car and shotgunned her right through the glass and killed her and her 8-month-old fetus and left her there dead and drove away. The police began investigating this. The state police were involved because it was on the Mass Pike. It was a state inner highway. So the state police were involved, the local police were involved, FBI came in. There was this huge investigation going on to determine what was happening. Her father, of course, told them all that he'd had this visit from these people that were trying to sell him Angiulo Brothers fire insurance. So the investigation started focusing in on Michael Angiulo. And so it turns out that this huge investigation, and front pages for like a week, and finally, this car comes screaming down the Mass Pike right past where that that get-off was, where she was, the rest area, and they throw a live guy, out of the back of the car. And he bounces down the road, like half a mile, bouncing around, breaking all of his bones, and slides to the side of the road. And a state highway patrolman comes rolling up and finds the guy lying there dying. And he recognizes the guy as one of the gunmen for Michelangelo. And he says, look, the cop says to him, the state police guy, says, look, you aren't going to make it, Johnny. You're not going to make it. I swear to God, if you will tell me who it is that put you up to doing this to this woman, I will get him for you. And the guy says, it was Michelangelo. And they come with the ambulance and they rush him to Mass General, and he lives. And so the following Monday morning, it's all over the front pages of the Boston Globe. I come into the office at Lee Bailey's office, and Lee calls me on the phone from his office. He says, Danny, you did your honors thesis at Harvard College on the Fifth Amendment, didn't you? I said, yes, I did. He says, come on into my office. So I come into his office, and he's got the Boston Globe in front of him, and he tosses it over to me, and he says, you saw all this on the front page? And I said, yeah, I saw that. He says, look, and he's got in the office, he's got Bad Andy Tooney, who was his chief investigator, and Al Johnson, who was his administrative attorney. And they're sitting in the office, and he says, we're expecting a call from Michelangelo. And I wanted to have you here because it's got to have something to do with the Fifth Amendment. He says, this guy, incriminating himself like that and under these false pretenses that he was going to die, and so you ought to be able to figure something out. He says, but we expect this call. And so just then his secretary comes into the office and she says, Mr. Bailey, it's Mr. Angiulo on the phone. And so Lee goes to the phone and he picks it up. He goes, Mikey, yeah. Oh, yeah, fuck. Yeah, I know, I saw it. Yeah, that's too bad. Yeah, that's terrible. Yeah. No, we'd be happy to do it. Yeah, we'll represent you. Well, that'll be $1 million cash up front for us, and another $1 million for our investigators. Whoa, Mikey. Okay, well, look, Mikey, fuck you too. And he hangs up on him. And he turns and he says, $100. He calls back in 5 minutes. And he reaches into his jacket, he takes out a $100 bill from his wallet and puts it on the table like that. And he turns to Al Johnson, he says, Al, you want a piece of this? Johnson says, okay, I got 100 here, I got 100, let's make it 10 minutes. And he puts it down. And then Bad Andy says, Andy, you want a piece of this? Yeah, he says, he takes out 250s, he puts them on the table, and he says, yeah, I'll take 15 minutes, and he'll call back. And he turns to me, and he says, do you want a piece of this, Danny? And I had said, no, I'm not going to have anything to do with this at all. And I got up and walked out, right? And the next night, I'm sitting there at my desk at my office, working away, and in walks Lee Bailey with Michelangelo. He comes walking in, and he says, and I saw him coming through the door, and he walks over, and he says, Danny, it's Michelangelo. And Angelo stands there with his hand out like that. And I just looked up at him. And I said, yeah, I know who it is. And he says, well, it's Michelangelo, with the guy we were talking about the other day. I said, yeah, I know that. He said, and so Michelangelo pushes him and he says, look, Lee tells me that you won't agree to help me on this case. And I looked up and I said, let me make it clear. I wouldn't piss on you if you were on fire. And he just looked at me, and he looked at Lee, and Lee was completely crushed. And all of a sudden, Michelangelo just lets out this huge laugh, and he says, this guy's got balls of steel, he says. And I said, yeah, but I'm still not going to do it, okay? And I wouldn't do it. And so that's what led me to the following Sunday. I was at Mass over at St. Cecilia's, and I was on the way back home. And I had this big discussion with Bailey about why he would in the world expect me to do something like that. Why would I do that? And it was like he just couldn't understand it, because he said, look, this is a major client. We're going to get like $2 million for doing this. And so even if he loses, we're still going to get the $2 million. I said, no. I said, you don't understand. I said, look, why did you become a lawyer anyhow? Did you just become a lawyer to try to make as much money as you possibly could? Or didn't you ever have any kind of ideals about being a lawyer or anything? And it was like, he was just kind of looking at me like, what? And so I was over at Mass, I say the following Sunday morning. That was Friday afternoon. And so I'm walking back home, and I stop in at this little bookstore, which I was wont to do on Sundays. And I was looking around. I found this book in there that was called A Theory of Justice by John Rawls. And John Rawls was the chairman of the Department of Philosophy at Harvard University. And so I took it off the shelf, and I started looking through it. And it was a major treatise that he had written toward the end of his career, his kind of magnum opus, like you're going to be writing, for the course, your magnum opus. And in it, he said that, he was questing to try to identify the specific criteria for justice in Western civilization. And so he said that he thought that he would discover that in a democracy, when a democracy was confronted with a particular public policy problem and a range of potential responses to it, that it's likely in a democracy that the juridical entities would end up selecting the option that generated the greatest good for the greatest number. The classic utilitarian, a majoritarian utilitarian ethical solution to the problem. But it turns out, he said, he was surprised in undertaking his major magnum opus to discover that that wasn't true. That, in fact, the decisions that were being made by the United States government weren't always just directly for the greatest good for the greatest number, because otherwise, why wouldn't we, he said, still have the white people own the 10% of the people that are black? Because it would be to their advantage. But they don't. And it's because of the intervention of a group of people that he referred to in his book called the intuitionists. And these intuitionists would say these things like, all men are created equal, they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are the right to life, liberty, and property. And they go on pontificating about these kind of metaphysical principles. And that these have an effect inside our culture to turn the decision makers away from a stark and rigid application of the ethical principle, the mode of ethical reasoning, of simple majoritarian utilitarianism. And that they set up some type of a compromise on that, taking into account these other metaphysical principles. And so I said, wow. I said, maybe this is what the conflict is I'm having with Bailey, is that he's an ardent utilitarian, self-interested type, and only does what's good for the firm. And so therefore, I may be one of these intuitionists. I better take this home and read it. So I brought it home, read it, and then Monday, I call up John Rawls' office. And I say to his secretary, I say, hello, this is Danny Sheehan. I went to Harvard College. I went to Harvard Law School. I worked on the Pentagon Papers. I'm waving the school tie at them through my phone, saying, can I possibly get a meeting with Professor Rawls? I'd like to talk about his new book with him. She said, well, I don't know. He's awfully busy. And I said, well, I also did this case and this other case and blah, blah, blah. And so she said, well, I'll ask him. So she goes away from the phone. She comes back and she says, okay, Wednesday afternoon for like 20 minutes. I said, good. So I finished reading the book and making notes on everything. And I go over there on Wednesday afternoon. And I go in. I sit down and start talking with him. And I started explaining to him how I'd read the book and how I was interested in this concept of the intuitionists and how they had a different mode of ethical reasoning than the majoritarian utilitarians. And I started telling him about the cases I'd done and all the kind of conflicts I'd had with Lee Bailey, with the senior partners at the Cahill firm, going on and on about all this stuff. And his eyes are getting big like saucers. And he's going to say, I didn't think anybody that was in the practical world really cared much about these kind of abstract philosophical discussions, he said. And I said, no, these are absolutely crucial. And I explained it all to him. So he canceled his next appointment, and we went on for an hour, and then he canceled another one, we went on for another hour. So I was there for almost 3 hours with him discussing all of this. And he asked me to come back to Harvard University to do a PhD in comparative social ethics, which I had never even heard about before. But there's this whole field of study of comparative social ethics. And so I went back and I filled out all the applications, and I'd saved up all this money from working for F. Lee Bailey and this big Wall Street law firm that I never used the money anyway. So I put in the thing to go to back to Harvard University, and I got accepted. And so that fall, I go back to Harvard, and I discovered when I showed up for registration that I was registered at the Divinity School. I thought I was going to be registered in the Department of Philosophy to study under John Rawls, but he had directed me to study under Dr. Ralph Potter. Dr. Ralph Potter was the professor who taught comparative social ethics, and he taught the PhD program, and he was based over at the Divinity School, at Harvard Divinity School. So they had enrolled me in the Harvard Divinity School, and I went over there, and what I learned was this third secret that I want to share with you, which they'd never told us about at any time in all the years as an undergraduate at Harvard College, never talked to us about it at Harvard Law School at all, but all of a sudden they started talking to us about it in the PhD program over at Harvard Divinity School. And it was this, and I just touched on this briefly again during one of the lectures, but as it turns out, Ralph Potter was the protege of Talcott Parsons. Talcott Parsons was the founder of the Department of Sociology at Harvard University. And he taught there for 50 years. And he is the one who originated the left-wing, right-wing sociological political bar graph for putting people along the political spectrum. And he had done this pursuant to a major set of inductive studies that they had done. That is, going out and gathering tons and tons and tons and tons of information from interviews, and then seeing if that data induced some particular set of principles that they could find to be operative generally, as distinct from deductive reasoning of postulating a certain set of principles and then deducing from them certain applications. This inductive process had led Talcott Parsons to believe that when our human family is confronted with any particular public policy problem or challenge, we will, he thought, based upon the inductive data they had, we would divide ourselves into 5 distinct factions.